I'm not sure how familiar you are with this field, so forgive me if you know all about it, or if I'm speaking too fast and it's all a little bit too rushed. But I understand the slides will be available so that you can look at them again if you want. I may switch off my no sound. Is there sound or no sound? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. The sound is perfect. Thank you.
Sorry, I just saw a note.
And you may move these and scroll.
The slides. I'll do that now. I can't seem to. Yeah. Oh, sorry, it's a bit too fast. Yeah, start again. Okay. So, lexical chunks is one of many, many terms to describe this phenomenon that I'll be talking to you about, that is so central to our ways of using language and has got potential benefits for teaching and learning. So these are some of the hundreds of labels that you have been used, and you can choose any that you wish. This is just a sample from the research literature. But broadly speaking, they may be defined as conventionalized combinations of words. And I will be explaining that to you more and giving you some examples. They are apparently available in every single language, including Ukrainian. In the next slide, I think Anna, I may have to ask it. Oh, it is working now. Yeah. So, as many of you will know, that human language production and comprehension is often assumed to be rule-bound. It's formed of vocabulary and syntax. It's made up of small units such as nouns, pronouns, verbs, adjectives, etc. And these can be manipulated into past and plural, passive, etc. This building block approach underpins most grammar books, language teaching, course books, and syllabi, many of which include invented illustrative examples of language use. Some of you will have heard of Noam Chomsky, his widely promoted language processing model called transformational grammar. Many of us, including many linguists, have discredited this model, however, and I will explain why. This is because over the last 30 years, large digital natural language corpora have been collated. That is to say, large collections of speech and writing, natural speech, natural writing, from the television, from all kinds of sources, from the newspaper, and these have been analyzed with automated digital tools and discovered that actually language is not as creative and rule-bound as was first assumed. Rather, up to 80% of language use consists of regularly repeated, ready-made combinations of language. One of the few resources that exploits this for language teachers is the Collins Co-Build series, which I can send a reference of if you want. So here are a few examples of chunks. These would be considered fixed chunks. And so, for example, in certain contexts, even I imagine in Ukraine, you say happy birthday, but there are other expressions such as how are you, take care, take it easy, what's up, bye for now, all the best. Sorry, yeah, thank you. And many other expressions in here in this list. Word combinations, pairs of words such as global warming, that's a set phrase. Brand new is a set phrase. Ladies and gentlemen, we would not normally say gentlemen and ladies. So this inflexibility, this way of saying, these perhaps slightly idiosyncratic ways of forms of language suggest that they are chunks. A very archetypal forms would be things like proverbs, and I don't know if you're familiar with these ones. A stitch in time saves 9. The early bird catches the worm. I'm sure you have many various equivalents in Ukrainian. And so these are archetypal, they're invariable in form, they're opaque in meaning, they're archaic in some way. But there is a second type of chunk which are more flexible. And these ones would be considered frames with slots. And examples of these, you'll be familiar with yours truly, yours, an alternative would be yours sincerely, yours faithfully. But now you see people just saying yours on the latter. Same with best wishes. Now you're seeing people just sometimes write best. And then there are other examples here, like I can hardly wait, he can hardly wait, she can hardly wait, we can hardly wait. But you wouldn't, they are not fully manipulatable. You wouldn't say, I can't hardly wait, or can I hardly wait. You can't make them negative, you can't make them make them into question forms, you can't make them into the future form. So this shows they're very constrained in what you can do with them or what you can put in the slots. And some of them even include different languages, such as are you au fait with? So these are some examples of flexible chunks. Next slide, thank you. So a very short, quick activity now is for you to think of some and note down any fixed chunks, or put them in the chat, and any perhaps write down if they're fixed and write down if they're flexible and pop them in the chat. Just a few, any examples from you. Thank you.
I have in mind our perfect phrase like Slava Ukraini, the glory to Ukraine. Is it supposed to be a chunk nowadays?
What does it mean again, Anna?
You know, today when we greet each other, we
mentioned this.
Slava Ukraini, so glory to Ukraine. Is it considered to be a chunk or
that would be definitely a chunk. It's you did mention this in another meeting, thank you. And that would be considered a chunk because it's used in a specific context. It's probably invariable. I don't think you would use different words in each slot or vary it. So that's a very good one. Yeah. Any other ones from? They're often very common, well, they can be very common, sort of often associated with everyday talk and greetings or sign-offs, very common phrases, but they can also be quite archaic. One more from anybody?
May I speak?
Yes, of course. You're welcome.
Today in our situation of war, we have a lot of different chunks which appeared right now. So the famous phrase "Доброго вечора, ми з України." Good night, we are from Ukraine in English, and I think it's a flexible chunk because everyone derives it in this or that way. For example, my husband, when he phones me, he said, "Доброго вечора, ми з Харкова," наприклад. Good night, we are from Kharkiv, if he's in Kharkiv, for example.
Those are really excellent examples and very, very topical.
Like все буде Україна, everything will be Ukraine or gonna be Ukraine. How are you? what's up,
Yeah.
take care, a lot of.
Yeah, thank you very much. These are excellent. I hope we can capture some of these. So if we move on to the next slide.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so this is, this is a definition, a very famous definition of chunks. There are several of them, but this I think is a good one in that this one refers to chunks as being a sequence of words which appears prefabricated, and that is stored and retrieved from the memory rather than being generated or analysed by the language grammar, so generated or compared to Alison Ray is a very well-known scholar in this field, a very good friend and colleague of mine, and this is a very famous definition. And this is focusing on the processing advantages of chunks. The next one. And then the next one is actually a combination of at least two words favoured by native speakers in preference to an alternative combination, which may have been equivalent had there been no conventionalization. And this second one, so the first one is looking at the processing advantages of chunks, and it is actually thought that the fact that we use up 80% or perhaps even more of our language use is actually made up of these prefabricated word combinations rather than being generated from scratch from its component units, is now considered to have two advantages. The first corresponds to the first definition, which is about processing efficiencies. It is psycholinguistic studies have shown that it is very effortful and time-consuming and exhausting to generate language completely freshly every time we want to use it or every time we want to comprehend it. So just by calling on these ready-made phrases is much less effortful for speakers or people who want to comprehend language. And the second benefit is about conventionalization, and it's actually related, it's more about sociolinguistic benefits, and it relates to the feelings of inclusion, the sense of belonging brought about by knowing the idiomatic, acceptable word combinations associated with different social arenas and topics and activities, and wanting to align oneself to these speech communities by using the same codes. Examples of these might be related to specific genres. So if any of you are interested in football, you'll know the specific phraseology associated with football. My partner is interested in football. If I ever try and say anything about football, I haven't got the correct phraseology and he just laughs. So it's clear, if we want to belong, we need to know the kinds of things that people say in that context. Knitting has its own code, talking about health, talking about business. Academia has its own codes. But all the examples that you showed a few minutes ago are very much about belonging, about knowing the shared codes and feeling part, having the shared identity by using those phrases. And if you don't use them, then you are outside that community, you fall outside. And some people choose to do that, but most people don't. So these are the two benefits, the two apparent functions of using ready-made phrases. The next slide, Anna. This second workshop activity, I'm not expecting you to necessarily spend much time on this, but if any of you, given that we do up to 80% of our language use is made up of these fixed and flexible chunks, can you think of any occasions when more creative or atomistic or rule-based language may be more appropriate? Any ideas? It's maybe a bit harder. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, so well, I would say when we try to produce some more original ideas, yeah, and possibly we are, I can imagine, we are talking about a story that has happened to us, you know, and here we can't rely exactly on chunks, yes, and we have to be again more creative, and maybe we would like to add some colors, you know, to what we are saying, yes, to bring out some emotions. And here we will need, yes, so those constructing our sentences and, you know, beautifying them, and here we need the rules, yeah.
Excellent. Yes.
In these situations.
Yeah. One other person wanted to speak. Can't see. Julia, is it Julia?
Okay. Hello. And I want to continue Oksana's idea. If we are talking about something creative, so there should be a creator, and a creator is a person who makes something unique. He is the author of it. And I just thought about a song, for example. I thought about a book, because we know that, for example, if we take Harry Potter, so there is a special language. Yes, there is a special language which was created for this very book. That's why if we're talking about creativeness, so they're like this.
Absolutely. Well, you both picked that up perfectly. I really want to stress the fact there is obviously a place for rule-based, more creative language in all forms of communication. The obvious examples are the ones you've said. That I mean, well, the perhaps most extreme example would be something like poetry. People want to be very, people are trying to break the rules a little bit, or push the boundaries, or be say something highly original. I mean, that being said, I'm sure you have all read very cliched poetry. Cliched poetry will be using a lot of ready-made language that you've heard many times, and but the kind of poetry that most people find intriguing or interesting or distinctive is that which breaks, which pushes the boundaries, which is highly creative. And the same would be for much literature, creative literature, fiction, invented, forms of writing. Again, a lot of criticism is around cliche, and cliche is in literature is often about using chunks, but there has to be a balance, because if you were to use highly creative writing all the time in literature or poetry, it could be actually extremely effortful to read it and make sense of it. So so we have to. We're always judging that balance constantly, all the time. So that. Thank you. So the next slide looks. It tries to explain this. How chunks might be accommodated in models of linguistic processing. So again, as I explained until recently, it was assumed that the adult linguistic processing system was fully atomistic, fully rule-bound. The proficient speaker used, made up, was constantly speaking in terms of tiny units of word size units or morphological units, and changing the verb forms, making things negative, combining things one word at a time. But now studies again of brain activity have shown that actually that there is a place for chunks in the brain, and the most popular model that has been discovered and explored is one called dual storage, a dual storage processing system, where an atomistic capacity in the left hemisphere, perhaps you've heard about. Often language has been associated with the left hemisphere, but actually there is now a sense that rule-bound language is associated with the left hemisphere, and chunk-based language, ready-made or flexible chunks, are in the right hemisphere. And one way that this had been discovered is through study of aphasia or language loss, you may be aware, some people suffer a stroke at any time in their life, and they have damage to their language. They may have damage to their language capacity. And studies have shown that some people, if the damage is in the left hemisphere, those people will use entirely ready-made chunks, sometimes a very, very limited number. Sometimes they won't be appropriate to the context, but somehow they have retained a number of chunks. And the alternative may be true, that people may damage their right hemisphere, and then they can only speak in highly creative language and rule-bound. And I would say neither of those sounds entirely natural or appropriate, but and sometimes that people can. Well, that's a really, 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 thank you for reminding me, Julia, of that. That singing is actually, all kinds of songs, hymns, happy birthday song, and children's songs are chunks, and rhymes are chunks, and some people can remember them. It was a very famous story. Sorry if I'm going off script now, but of a nun. You know what a nun is? A religious. I can't. You'll have to say the name in Ukrainian. A religious woman, part of the church. She suffered severe aphasia, language loss after a chunk, and the only utterance that she could produce was something we call the Lord's Prayer. It's a traditional long prayer called the Lord's Prayer, is Our Father, etc. And she could only produce that, and she couldn't. It was not possible to kind of interrupt her or ask her to start in the middle or use sections of it. It was, and I thought that was a very, again, and a very interesting example of this memory. So thank you, Julia, for I will add that to my notes for next time. But although this is very appealing, this idea of left and right brain and their activity, and there's a lot of evidence to support it, most people, including me, think it's a bit more permeable, it's a bit more flexible. The very fact we have flexible chunks suggests that there is some connection between the two, that there is not, you don't just use one or the other, but that there's a kind of continuum of rule-bound and a holistic language activity. Next slide, Anna. Thank you. So I include this slide around first language acquisition because some of you will have children and have noticed and be interested. I know Anna has a little boy, and you'll be interested, you will have been interested in their own child language acquisition. And again, traditionally, it was assumed that just as it was assumed that proficient adults use language in a rule-bound way, it was assumed that children learnt language in forms of an atomistic way. They learned grammar, they learned vocabulary, and they learned how to combine it. And again, this was sort of what Chomsky presented. So often when people were looking at how children acquired languages, they were looking at how they combined words and how they made sentences, and how this vocabulary and syntax developed together. However, increasingly, when children's language development has been monitored and explored, it has been noticed as actually what children are doing, what infants are doing at age 1, 1.5, 2, whatever, is they are copying the chunks that their parents say. So, or understanding the chunks. So if you are saying your child all the time to sit down or put their coat on, or they're receiving, they're understanding a whole approximate phrase relating to a garment, relating to a chair, and relating to, doing something, go to bed, they don't understand the individual words. They just understand the broad concept because it's repeated so many times in a very, very specific context. They gradually understand. It's very limited what the children are exposed to. So now speech is monitored. It's becoming increasingly clear that what children are doing is actually mimicking these general phrases, often quite imprecisely. And so there'll be some approximation of some phrase that parents might not even realize that their children are actually using these chunks to mean something related to the bed or relating to, sitting or whatever. Or but they're actually they're now discovering that chunks are forming the basis of rule-based language development. So over time, children will notice that that there are these variations within some chunks. Some remain the same, and some the slots change. So go to bed and go to school. And that may not be the best example, but they distinguish variations, and they now notice that school is has a separate meaning to bed, or and go to seems to involve some kind of movement. And this is a revelation in terms of how language is acquired, notions of language acquisition, and quite a powerful shift in understanding. So they're talking about child language acquisition as a process of item learning, so learning whole chunks, and then system learning, using those chunks to identify systems over time, the system of a language. And that can apply, of course, to children can be bilingual, multilingual from very young, and they'll be applying the same process to these languages. So now I move to nearly my last slide. This is about what I assume is you're here for, and it may be most interest to you. So my argument, and those of many of us who've been working in this field now for a number of years, is that if chunks are so central to adult competent language processing, this is how how adults normally communicate in everyday life, how they normally understand things in everyday life, if they correspond to up to 80% of how we use language, and if they seem to be the way children acquire languages, they would appear to have a role in second language learning, modern language learning, the kind of language learning and teaching that you're involved in. But you'll probably, I assume that just as most of the language learning and teaching materials that I've worked with, most of them still focus on assume language is highly rule-bound, that it involves these atomistic units, that people have to somehow learn how to combine these units or manipulate these units. And that is very effortful and very slow. And it means that many people can take years to be able to produce something meaningful, and often it won't even be idiomatic or what people say. It won't necessarily, people can understand it, but it won't be the phrase that is most acceptable in a particular context. That's why we have lots of learners who say things that we perfectly acceptable, but not quite right. And so this has very important implications for language learning and teaching. I'm sure that in all of your course books, there will be some list of ready-made phrases, as well as all the lists of vocabulary and all the grammatical forms that are gradually introduced. I'm not saying that chunks don't feature at all in courses, course materials, grammar books, and teaching materials, but it's just they're often quite peripheral or considered a sort of extra, rather than being very central to language learning and teaching. And so, next slide, Anna. So this is what I want to talk to you about, mainly that I was very fortunate. This is quite a long time ago. It would probably be before most of you were born. It was in the 1990s when I was working in Ecuador, in Quito, and with the British Council. This was a very special place. I should say that I have a lot of respect for the British Council. I've worked with them for many years, but this is not typical of what the British Council does. There in Quito, we were so fascinated by the role of chunks, a few of us, and we decided to set up an experimental syllabus, which involved teaching people, adults, young adults and older adults, from the very beginning, from complete beginners through chunks. And I'll talk you through this, what we did, because some of this could be useful to you. So we started off by talking to students at the beginning of the class in Spanish, to be honest, explaining a little bit in a condensed way about this new research on the significance of chunks in proficient language communication, its role in every language, getting them to think about it in Spanish, and getting them to realize, this could make sense, and it could be a very efficient way of learning language, and it could make language learning much quicker, much more natural, much more idiomatic, much more fluent. And then, but they all were very interested and curious, fortunately. And then we started by, rather than, I don't know, presenting language through normal course books, lists of phrases on clothing, or phrases on, vocabulary on clothing, or introducing the present tense or whatever. We gave people a small number of useful chunks from day one, a very small number. We explained what they meant. We practiced them with them so they could hear them, they could reproduce them. And they were chunks that we knew they could use from the first day. And one of them, they fell into two categories. One was learning orientated, so what they could use in the classroom, and I'm sure you do this a bit too, but we told them how to say, how do you say X in English, how do you, and so they could ask us as teachers, or, immediately, if they wanted to know something, how do you say ... in English, or what does Y mean? Or how do you spell Z? So we gave them these useful phrases so that they could already ask for things that they really, really wanted to say, what they really wanted to know. And we gave them some socially oriented chunks. At that time, we had a little idea that after 6 weeks, one group would meet another group, and they would have a little party in the cafe, which was part of the British Council Teaching Centre. And so they could meet other students, and they would have to they would do some social interaction with them. And so that was a little goal for them. And they were in it. And so we were building up to this little party. And we gave them some chunks for it, but they also asked us for things, what they wanted to know. And so we built up a large repertoire with them, but always things that we felt could be relevant or they felt could be relevant. And sometimes it was based on things like a student might come into the class and they might look a bit sad, or they might be late, or there might be something not quite right. And we would ask them, are you okay? You know, and is everything all right? And they might want to say, I'm not feeling very well, or I'm sad, or my grandmother died, you know. They might want to say something that is real and relevant, not talking about clothing. I have this thing about clothing, you know, but many things I think in course books are of peripheral useful or value. You may never need to talk about clothing, you know, but you may want to say that you're sad, or you may want to say that your grandmother's died, and these are really important. They're about people's identity, about what matters. So then I would say to them, give them expression, I'm sad today, or and then of course that has a little slot, you know, that you can change sad for something else. And then I would teach people how to say, I'm sorry to hear that, which is a very natural response. So they're very real and relevant phrases. And again, I feel I have a very strong feeling that most of what is taught in course books is not real and relevant. So this is a way of making language learning more real and relevant, and it will vary according to the age of your students, their interests and their needs inside in the. So sometimes they came, something had happened, I don't know, in Ecuador, and I imagine in Ukraine at the moment there were a lot of power cuts, so we often didn't have power, and so they couldn't do their homework or things like that, and so language talked about that, and I gave them phrases to talk about things that were happening now. And then, so as I said in here in this list, I showed them how chunks may include slots. We discussed different variations. And then I also, in order to get them to reinforce the chunks, apart from practicing them orally as whole phrases, we had little mini tests. Sometimes they tested each other, so that they would fix them in their memory. Other activities, as they got more sophisticated, when they were reading a text, or I would get them to underline what they might think could be word combinations or useful chunks, and so they would share them, or that we would list them together. So noticing is an important part of becoming aware of them. And I think that is really most of the kind of things that we did. And then gradually they became more and more proficient. And now with my university students, I teach a lot of English for academic purposes, and I encourage students there to read academic texts and to really notice the word combinations that make a text academic. So helping them build up their repertoire at a high level, and to reuse those, because even as you will know, what we call academic literacy, even people who are first language speakers of English don't necessarily know how to write in that way. It's not just about additional language learnings. So helping first and additional language learning to acquire a new genre of using language can be helpful using chunks. I think it's the last slide, Anna. One more slide?
No, one more slide about workshop.
One more slide?
One more slide, workshop activity, if we have time.
I think it's just can we do the last slide?
This is the last slide. It is on the screen. We have a couple of minutes.
You don't have the last slide. Okay, no problem. The last slide on my set was simply to let me just find my set. It was to ask you a little bit what you thought about this approach, but also to come just before we close. I know we have we started a little late, and I'll just run over for 5 minutes. But to also think about any challenges or any that you may perceive around teaching chunks. That was my very last slide. If you want to speak, put your little hand up, your little virtual hand. If you can think of anything positive, but also any concerns you might have, or any worries or any issues that you think need to be addressed. Should we start with you? Is it Oksana? Yeah.
Yeah, so, I wanted to comment on a comment I received from one of my students. So she said, I've done all the grammar activities in Murphy and in, lots of other grammar books, but still when it comes to speaking, it's very, very difficult for me to express myself. And when I was listening to your presentation today, it really hit me that it's all about chunks, so that person is not adding any chunks. She doesn't know how to express herself in the language, although she knows the rules. And so that is why I believe that's really important. And the fact that it should be central to language learning, that was really interesting to me. So thank you very much for that, topic. As for difficulties, I believe that probably. Well, first of all, it can be overwhelming, because there are so many chunks, and you have to learn them, and you have to remember them, and you have to process them. And secondly, it's like, I kind of lost my idea, but it's very bound to a specific context. I mean, you really need to think about a student's life, what is really relevant for him or her. Because, for example, in the times of war that we are going through right now, suddenly all this very, very peripheral vocabulary about wartime, has become relevant. And it's quite unusual, but this is what students want to talk about, because this is the reality and they face it. But in the other time, you would talk more about, I don't know, holidays, or parties, or social activities. So it's like, I think that's my idea, and I'm finishing. Why in course books they do not use these chunks as this central approach to language learning? It's because it's so much bound to a specific context. Because, for these groups of learners, for these people, these chunks would be relevant, and for those on the other side of the world, maybe it would be sort of different. Of course, there are chunks that, everybody needs, and that they use in the language, but, it's kind of something that a teacher should think about, what to teach. Maybe.
Thank you very much. I'll just come in quickly, because I know we're running out of time. And Julian wants to be. Two responses, a very helpful observation. First, I studied languages a very long time ago, again, before you were born, but I studied languages at A level, which is kind of 17 to 18, and I was considered very good in languages. I'm half Italian, so that kind of helps. And I had straight A's in languages. And I went to France. I studied French. French was one of my university level languages. I went to France to study. I had a year in France while I was at university. And although I was very good at literature and writing essays, I really struggled. I couldn't speak in a idiomatic. It was a shock to me to be a grade student and to find that somehow I wasn't sharing this, the same phraseology, and that was a wake up call for me. And just the second point you made. I agree that probably course books are trying to accommodate a sort of have a one-size-fits-all approach to all students. But to my mind, that is extremely demotivating. You as teachers, you have a good, you know your students, you care for them. Right now, you have a more important role than ever, trying to support them, and it seems all the more important a little bit to you have to. I mean, one of the challenges I thought maybe one of you might make a mention is you probably have a syllabus, you probably have to use a course book to some degree, but if there are ways of working with it, around it, and making the language more suitable to your students' needs, I think that would be much more motivating to them and more meaningful to them. Otherwise, I think language learning can be highly demotivating. So I think it's a question of working with the course book, but responding to your students' needs at the same time. So have we got time, Anna, for Julia's question? Or do we have to finish now?
If she is going to be very, very, yes, in brief.
Go ahead. Oh.
So the greatest challenge is resources, of course, firstly, because we are not native speakers, as Oksana has told, that we should have them authentic resources for us to use them correctly. It's firstly. Secondly, a challenge is that now in Ukraine, we have Ukrainian authors of English textbooks, and it is not sometimes, appropriate. Again, because we are not native speakers. And just from my own experience, I have been listening to you, and now I understand that I did it correctly because I'm using this chunk approach to teaching my students read. My primary school readers, they can read chunks.
Yes.
It's very easy for them. Even they don't know the rule, how to read, it's very difficult. And now I understand that I'm doing correctly. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Those are fantastic observations. I must say, you mustn't put your language speaking. I am so impressed by all of your English language skills, and you are using chunks all the time. And you don't have to be, this idea of high proficiency native speak is a myth. And all you need to do is introduce learners to language that is relevant and meaningful and authentic, as you say. And I think this post up here, I think is really relevant again, really useful, that if you explain to students, if you have their buy-in, if you get them to understand the value of chunks, you're giving them the tools, I think, to support their own language learning as well, and they can start to use it more themselves. So I think I'm going to have to, I think Anna wants me to go now. So
thank you. I believe there are no other questions. Lina, thank you very much. This session is brilliant, and everybody writes that thank you. I do hope to see you as soon as possible, and we may discuss and share our impressions as well. But I do appreciate your support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, all of you, for your lovely your wonderful response, your openness, your interest in this area, and your brilliance. I am amazed, at how you're even able to think about these things right now. But again, I just want you to know that all of us in Britain are with you in every way, and sending you all the strength we can, and we will continue to do so as long as it's needed. So goodbye for now.
Thank you. And